So here's my globe again, which I'll be pointing to a lot. And here's a couple of things. So we've got a learning goal. You need to be able to talk about the International Dateline, IDL, and also Universal Coordinated Time and Greenwich Meridian Time or Greenwich Mean Time, and how time zones work. You need to be able to calculate time zones in a couple of different ways. These are syllabus references. I've just been discussing my annoyance at one of the ways, but I'll explain that to you as we move forward. So a couple of questions for you to think about to start with. What do you already know about time zones? Hopefully you already know some stuff like how Australian time zones work. Hopefully you already know that if you drive over the New South Wales border now, you will be affected by a time zone. Not a time zone exactly, but by daylight savings, and they have it and we don't. And when have you had to think about them? So obviously in those cases, probably the main times you really have to think about it is when either you're travelling overseas or maybe when you are corresponding with somebody overseas by something a little bit more speedy than post. So here's the first question that we're going to talk about, and I'm going to ask you this in a minute, but not yet. If it's 10 a.m. in the Gold Coast, what time is it on the longitudinal line that is exactly opposite the Gold Coast on Earth? But we'll give it a second. First, let's have a look at the international date line in this map. Here's the world. Whoop, I can't move stuff. Okay. So here's a map of the world. This is a flat map of the world. And so it's been spread out to fill the corners because you can't really make a sphere flat. But there's the international date line. Does anybody know why it looks like this? So all the islands in here. So some of the islands are inside this sort of hammer-looking shape and some of them are outside, but it's about consistency. So if you've got a group of islands that form a country, then there is a desire to allow that country to be in the same side of the same hemisphere so that it's the same day, because we're quite early. In terms of New Year's, just to make New Year's is a really good reference point. We see New Year's quite early. The Sydney fireworks that happen, they're one of the earliest fireworks. When I lived in the UK, I'd watch the Sydney fireworks at lunchtime over there. And Auckland is obviously even earlier again. And then time travels around the earth like this. At the moment in America, it's still Sunday. Have you backtracked to this international date line? That is almost a day behind us because we're right at the start. So we're the furthest ahead in terms of time. We finish our week first, but we also start our Monday mornings first. That's the situation there. In terms of state borders in Australia, if we go from here to New South Wales, it affects us by an hour, which is a bit annoying, but it's not really that bad. But here, it's a whole day. So on one of these islands here, it's Sunday and the other one is Monday. So there's a desire to get the clusters to be the same day on the same side of that international date line. So we have a jagged date line because of that. Up here, this is Siberia, part of Russia. That's Alaska, part of America. They're quite close, usually a lot closer than people realise. And the international dateline jags between those. So this part of Siberia is Monday and America's still on Sunday. So you get that big difference. And yet you can travel between them pretty easily. Anyway, so that's what you're dealing with. But anything that you're asked to do in an exam, you'll be given the information for that you need. Any questions on this? You'll see the dashes up the top here. Can anybody see these dashes that are hanging around with the degrees? So if I just get this working, there we go. You'll see it's 120 degrees here, dash, 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 180 degrees. That's 180 degrees from the Greenwich Meridian line. How many dashes are in between 120 and 180? 3 dashes. How many gaps are there? 4. So what's each gap worth in terms of degrees? 25%, but if it goes from 120 to 180, what's each gap worth? 15. So each gap is worth 15 degrees. That's going to be quite important because how many hours in a day? 24. How many gaps do you think are along the top here? 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. There's 6 groups of 4, so there's 24 dashes along the top. and you could do 360 degrees divided by 24, but the end result is that there's 24 hours in a day. That means 1 hour is 15 degrees around the globe. Can everybody see that, either through the division or just through using the gaps on there? So the 15 degree gaps will be identified on most maps, and you've already been dealing with it in exercise 5B and your work with position on the globe. Each of these longitudinal lines is separated by 15 degrees. And the reason why 15 degrees is so special, more special than 10 degrees or 20 degrees or even 30 degrees, is that in a 24-hour day, 15 degrees represents 1 hour. Now, this is one thing you'll need to be able to do, and we'll talk a little bit more about it in a minute. But basically, if we travel, so we're currently in Australia, and if we travel around from our position in Australia 15 degrees this way, it will be an hour earlier. Technically, or mathematically, or theoretically, it will be an hour earlier, but that's not how the time zones quite work. So I'm going to show you in a map in a moment of the time zones. You'll know that the whole of Queensland is one time zone. As soon as you step over from Queensland in the Northern Territory or South Australia, it's a different time zone. But that doesn't follow an exact 15 degree time segment. So one thing you might need to do if you've got no other information is two places on Earth are separated by, say, 68 degrees on the east-west line. Well, then you'll get that 68, you'll divide it by 15. That'll come out as about 4.55, and that means that there's 4.55 hours between them. Now then you've got to take another step and consider what is the context of the question being asked. 4.55 hours is the theoretical solution, but time zones are always either an hour or 2 hours or 3 hours. Some of them, like South Australia and there's parts of India, have a half-hour time zone gap. So you might have a half hour, so we could say 4.5 hours and do some rounding, but it might actually just be a 5-hour time zone as well. So you've got to be reasonable about your answers there as well. So there's going to be some rounding issues, etc. Anyway, let's have a look at the time zone map. And this one is in your textbook, and if you need it, we'll provide you this one or something quite similar in your exam. That's what the time zone map looks like. So it's pretty all over the place, but if you go along the top here, these are the hours before or after Greenwich Mean Time, which is at 0. So England is in Greenwich Mean Time, and that means that everywhere in England is currently 0 hours from itself. But, and you can see that happens all of here. But then if we come across here, the 1 hour gap there, parts of Germany, France, Poland, Italy, they're all 1 hour ahead of England. So if you went from England to France, you would gain an hour. It's a bit funny, there's not really a purple line in here, but it does cut down into Algeria. If we come across to Australia, you can see Australia is separated into 3 time zones because that's how wide we are. We're about 45 degrees wide. We've got the east coast of Australia, the centre of Australia, and then the west coast. And that's in the, where are we at, 11, it's a bit mixed. It's in your textbook on page 240, I think, which is a better diagram if you want to have a look at it. But you can see the 11 down here. I think there's another reference to 11 somewhere else as well. 11, 9. So maybe, yeah, this must, so we're 10. And then South Australia and Northern Territory are 9. And Perth is 8. 2 hour time difference there. But at the moment, we have a 3 hour time difference with Perth because they have daylight savings time as well. So we have those other issues that are occurring. Any questions? Yeah.
Will daylight savings be included in questions or?
It might be, but what we'd be specific. So we don't expect you to know that New South Wales has got daylight savings or Victoria does and we don't off the top of your head. And in fact, your exam's probably going to ask about any country in the world. But what might happen is you need to know how to deal with daylight savings, because we might ask you a question that says, we're at Anchorage in Alaska, which is GMT minus 11 hours. And we're trying to talk to somebody who's in Lisbon, Portugal, that's GMT plus 1 hour, but they also have an hour daylight savings, and you've got to work out how to deal with that. So the information will be there. We don't expect you to memorise who has daylight savings and who doesn't, but we do expect you to be able to use it. Okay? Any questions on that? So, go back to that question at the start. Which meridian line is exactly opposite 10 degrees east? Any takers on that? This map's a time zone map, so it's not ideal, but I'll show you about where 10 degrees east is, Noah. United Kingdom is there. Eastern hemisphere is this way. 10 degrees east is about here. It's not that far away, because obviously that's 180 degrees. So 10 degrees east is just 10 degrees past United Kingdom. Where is exactly opposite on the globe from 10 degrees east? As a number. I'm not looking at a place, as a number. I've gone that way 10 degrees. That side, and do you know what number? 170, perfect. 170 degrees west. Okay? That will be exactly the opposite on the globe. So if I go along here, there's the United Kingdom, there's 10 degrees east. If I go to the other side, it'll be about 170. And you're welcome at any time to come and grab one of these two globes and have a look at it and play around with that. If it's currently 10 AM on the Gold Coast, what time will it be on the opposite side of the planet? Any takers? And this is theoretical again. What if I told you on the opposite side of the planet, so the Gold Coast is, where are we? Missed it, haven't I? There. Gold Coast is there. Opposite side of the planet's here. This is 24 hours. If it's 10 AM on the Gold Coast, it's 10 PM on the opposite side of the planet. Okay? And that's the way this works, is if it's 10 AM on the Gold Coast, remember the sun rises in the east, sets in the west. So we see it come up here because the Earth is spinning this way. My fist is the sun. It spins into the sun. You can see it all day. And then it spins away from the sun. But while I'm spinning here at 10 o'clock in the morning, over here is in darkness. And it hasn't been in darkness for that long because it was night time and like early afternoon there. Spun around. The Gold Coast has got sun now, but this side's in darkness. Is that all right? And also there's some really good reasons why you can see the tilt of the Earth here. And that's the reason why we have some seasons, summer and winter, etc. Because the Earth goes like this throughout the year and tilts back and forward. And so while the sun's here, we're in winter because we're below. But then as we tilt differently, we go to summer, we go to winter, in between, etc. That's a conversation for another day. You don't need to know that. Opposite to us is going to be 2 hours pre Greenwich Mean Time. So Greenland, maybe parts of Brazil, they're about the opposite side of the world to us. Yeah? Any questions? Cool. I think that's about it for now then. There's just little chunks. So let me just talk quickly about this example, and then I might get you to do the first set of questions. Singapore is located 1 degree north and 104 degrees east, and Sydney is located at 34 degrees south and 151 degrees east. What is the time difference between Singapore and Sydney? So this is the example. What are the important figures that are given to us, and which figures are not important? So Sydney's about here, Singapore's here, and Singapore's 1 degree north. You can see I'm just above the equator. Sydney's 34 degrees south. Does it matter about the north and south? It matters about that gap there in terms of angle. So what's that gap? This is 104 degrees east, this is 151 degrees east. 47 degrees. So the gap, we don't care about the north-south, but in terms of the east-west or the longitudinal gap, there is a 47 degree difference. And how many hours is 47 degrees approximately? Divide by 15 and we get 3 2/15 of the fraction, which is approximately 3 hours. So again, 3 2/15, which is 3 hours and 8 minutes. 15 goes into 60 quite nicely. So 2/15 multiplied by 4, we get 8/60. So 3 hours and 8 minutes time difference. But then we go back to the question and we look and we think, is this going to require a contextual answer? There's no way it will be 3 hours and 8 minutes because there's no time zone system that sets that up. So it's going to be 3 hours. Maybe it's 4 hours depending on how the time zones are set up. Maybe it's 2 hours, but it's probably 3 hours. And let's go back and have a look at our time zone map, which this question didn't ask you to refer to, but just out of interest. Again, the quality is not great on here, but I can see Sydney is in that 10-hour zone, and it looks to me like Singapore, which is also a part of this tip of Malaysia here, is in the 8-hour gap, possibly with Perth, but Sydney's got the 1 hour extra due to daylight savings time. I actually don't know whether Singapore has daylight savings time, and so therefore it's probably a 3 hour gap, and that's information from here. But our division gives us that 3 hour gap approximately as well. So you've got to read the question and try and work out what information the question's given you and what information you can use. When you get a time zone map, you're going to find a lot of the time that time zone map is still missing lots of information. It won't have lots of located cities. It will have some, but not all. So if you're required to use a time zone map, any question you get, there will be the information on that map, but there won't be for everything. And lastly, here's Australia's breakdown, but that doesn't deal with daylight savings. And so some states makes that statement here. Some states have daylight savings. Queensland time is 10 hours ahead of GMT, but Sydney is 11 hours ahead of GMT when they include daylight savings. So when it's 6 o'clock here, it's 7 o'clock in Sydney, and that's the extra hour. New Zealand, on the other hand, is 12 hours ahead of GMT. So there's the map, and the colours represent the situation. So the pink is 12 hours, and the orange is 11 hours, and then the yellow is 10 hours. The green is 9.5. So here's a half, and then Western Australia is +8. So there's some further information we need it. All of these diagrams are from your textbook anyway. 5C, question 1 to 6, and I'm going to leave you now with that.